Hi, Julie.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I love it.
It's great to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing your talk. You can start, Julien. It's almost 12:05, so we don't want to add any more delays. We just want to hear Julie.
Yeah. All right, perfect. Well, bonjour, hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second of many Women in Robotics, or Robotics au féminin events, featuring Associate Professor Julie Shah from the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT. These events will feature women who have chosen a career in robotics. Why? Well, simply because women and non-binary people are well underrepresented in this field. In the field of robotics, of course, but also in the field of engineering at large. According to Engineers Canada, 17% of engineers are women. The goal is to reach 30% representation in 2030 because it is thought that at 30%, this will be sufficient to gain momentum and have sustainable cultural change. But diversity in engineering and robotics is not only a question of statistics, it has a profound impact on the way we, as a society, as scientists, as engineers, approach problems and find impactful solutions. With the rise of smarter robots and the importance of human-machine collaboration, let's make sure that humans behind the machines are well represented and diverse. Like I mentioned earlier, our guest today is Julie Shah. Julie received her bachelor's and her master's from the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT and her PhD in autonomous systems from MIT. Before joining the faculty, she worked at Boeing Research and Technology on robotics applications for aerospace manufacturing. She has developed innovative methods for enabling fluid human-robot teamwork in time-critical, safety-critical domains ranging from manufacturing to surgery to space exploration. Her group draws on expertise in artificial intelligence, human factors, and systems engineering to develop interactive robots that emulate the qualities of effective human team members to improve the efficiency of human-robot teamwork. In 2014, Shah was recognized with the NSF CAREER Award for her work on human-aware autonomy for team-oriented environments, and by the MIT Technology Review T332 list as one of the world's top innovators under the age of 35. Good job. Her work on industrial human-robot collaboration was also recognized by the Technology Review as one of the 10 breakthrough technologies of 2013. And she has received international recognition in the form of Best Paper Awards and nominations from the International Conference of Automated Planning and Scheduling, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, the IEEE ACM International Conference on Human-Robot Interaction, the International Symposium on Robotics and Human Factors in Ergonomics Society. She is also the co-author of the book, What to Expect When Expecting Robots. The book, What to Expect When Expecting Robot, dives in the details of what considerations robot designers should take into account to create machines that not only work for humans, but with humans. It also highlights the conversation we, as a society, need to have around the future of robotics in our public and private environments. Without further ado, here's Julie, who will present her journey in her career and also her research.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me here. I'm delighted to be here. So I think what I can do is start by talking a little bit about, I guess my journey. And what I'll say is that I don't normally give talks about that. So what I'll do is, just talk you through a little bit about where I started and how I got to where I am. To provide you some entry points for questions or just, for the Q&A, to dive into, what it is you'd like to dive into further. And then I'll share a little bit about my ongoing research in the lab and future directions in robotics and human-robot collaboration. So let's see. So by way of introduction, let's see. So I am originally from New Jersey, a little south of New York City, and you know, growing up, I spent most of my childhood in the summers at the beach, and was kind of a bookworm. And so I would, you know, bring books with me everywhere. And I was very fortunate that I always enjoyed school, and you know, had a number of wonderful teachers and mentors, and my parents who very early on introduced me to engineering and science more broadly. And so, you know, I think from basically my earliest memories, I didn't want to be a roboticist, but from my very earliest memories, I was fascinated with rocket ships and airplanes, and wanted to be an astronaut. So that's sort of, you know, my maybe from when I was 3. You know, there's videos of me talking about how I want to design rocket ships and be an astronaut. And so you fast forward nearly 40 years later, I'm no longer under 35. I'm now professor at MIT in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and I am not an astronaut, but I am something way better, which is, you know, in a position to sort of envision the future on so many levels, including for spaceflight and for other applications. And I found my way to MIT for 2 main reasons. So one is in the mid 90s, when the Mars rover landed on Mars. I'm not sure sort of the age group of the folks here, but when I lectured to the undergrads, you know, none of them were born. But it was July 4th, that rover landed, and I was sort of glued to CNN the whole day. I was just enthralled by this. And they kept showing these pictures of mission control, and in this little logo, like Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I'm like, what is this Jet Propulsion Laboratory where people send things to Mars? And I went on whatever the early version of the internet was there, and like Metacrawler or something, and Googled Jet Propulsion Laboratory and looked into what those jobs were. And they had this little pie chart, and it's like, you know, the vast majority of people that work at JPL have these things called PhDs. And I'm like, this is interesting. And then concurrently, I was very fortunate. My parents sent me to space camp in Alabama around that time. And they gave us this booklet of all of the astronauts in the US space program and the places they went to school. And I was looking through that and just counting, you know, looking where people went to school to become astronauts. And the vast majority of them went to MIT. And I said, okay, so if I want to be an astronaut, I need to go to MIT. And if I want to send things into space, I need a PhD. And so I applied to MIT and was very, very fortunate to get in. And I joke, it's one of those things where, like, when you go away to school at 18, you don't think that you're never going to leave. But that is pretty much what happened to me. I came to MIT at 18, and I have mostly been here since. I did my degree at MIT in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and specialized back then in the program that was sort of called Information Technology. And from there, I had good grades and was sort of invited to apply to graduate school in the department. And I only applied to one graduate program, and that was MIT and AeroAstro, only because I received a form letter because of my GPA, which was not perfect, but it was high enough, I guess, inviting me to apply. And I remember going to one of the professors in one of my classes and asking if, you know, a grad school was a good idea. And he kind of stopped and he said, well, I'm a little biased, but I do think it's a good idea. And that was it. So really up until that point, my dream had been to go and be a civil servant at NASA and, you know, do space missions. And so I stayed on for graduate school. And through that process, for most of my undergrad degree, I was a double major in aero-astro and physics. Not a perfect student, but I took on things, and it was a heavy course, like just because I enjoyed it. And I never worried too much about optimizing for GPA. I've always just kind of followed what was exciting and interesting to me. And so there's a coherent thread based on my interests, but you'll see kind of through my trajectory, I have to often kind of explain externally why all these sort of pathways through are coherent. And in my senior year, I had a choice between taking one last class. I needed one last lab class in physics to get my double major in physics, Or I could take this hybrid undergrad-grad class in AeroAstro called Principles of Autonomy and Decision Making, which was essentially like an AI course for engineers, specifically thinking about autonomous systems. For aerospace, has strong focus on that. And I just thought, well, it's just a really interesting topic. I don't know anything about that. And so I signed on for this kind of grad level course as a senior. I let my physics double major go. In retrospect, that was a great idea. Because I enjoyed that last course, my spring of my senior year, so much that I built the rest of my career around it. So it was a great decision for me. And in that class, I'm sure many of you have sort of similar feelings today, but part of the reason I was drawn to aerospace was because of sort of the wonder that people had when they described what it was they were doing. I worked at the Goddard Space Center, I worked at the Johnson Space Center, and folks that are in the aerospace endeavor, like when you ask them, what do you do? Like they start by describing like, well, there's this question we have about the universe. And then you're like, no, but what do you do? And they're like, well, there's going to be the space telescope that's going to, address these questions. So like, no, what do you do? And then finally you get like, okay, I'm, a structural engineer. And, but that's sort of that wonder, that sort of forward looking vision, and like a sense of magic to it. In that course, my senior year, we had a number of guest lectures that came through that course, faculty and senior researchers, mostly from MIT, and they would show the latest in, like walking robots. We had Cynthia Brazil, so the latest in social robots, which is like a brand new and emerging field. And as every one of these, guest lectures came through, I just felt like what they were showing me was like basically magic. Like it was magic that someone could imagine that and create a system so capable in those ways. And I knew it wasn't magic, that I could learn how to do that too, and was just really inspired to kind of take a next step towards what ended up being a career pursuing AI and robotics. I'm still faculty in the AeroAstro department. I have a special love of aerospace applications and time critical and safety critical applications. But from there, I did my master's degree with the opportunity that provided me funding with great mentors, professors, in what was then called the Manned Vehicle Lab. And I did my master's degree essentially in human factors engineering, understanding how to design technology like cockpits, like cockpit automation, to sort of fit like a puzzle piece with human capability. And for pilots, like when it's like critical, when it really has to be flawless in order to provide value. And then from there, through my master's degree, I received a fellowship. I applied for an NSF fellowship, which gave me full flexibility of what to do for my next step. And so I went around and talked to a number of professors around MIT to think about what I might do from there. And this, AI sort of drew me, and in robotics drew me. I talked to a number of faculty that worked in that space here, and ended up as a PhD student really making a turn into computer science. I took many of the full set of undergrad courses in computer science that I hadn't already had the material from in other ways. It was a very kind of steep learning curve. I really hadn't even programmed substantially before moving into my PhD. And I've always been grateful for the PhD advisor that I had, because when I sort of fessed up to him, like, I really haven't programmed much, he sort of shrugged and said, so you'll learn. And so, it was a learning curve, but, I learned. And when I looked to take on grad students, the particular skills and tools you have are not really the most important selection criteria for kind of success, especially in the research endeavor. And so in a sense, a risk was taken on me to move into was a new field. And I moved into robotics through my PhD. And I think one of the things that I came to understand later, which is really exciting, is that aerospace, we talk about that as being a systems discipline. It's a systems discipline, right? When in a systems discipline, you can optimize the individual components for a satellite or a spacecraft, and then you put it together and you have a highly suboptimized whole. Robotics is a systems discipline as well. And a lot of that sort of educational approach and thinking about how you design complex systems to embed or mesh well with people sort of took with me as I moved forward to do research in in AI and robotics. And so I think I came through that field with a different path. And if you followed the path that I did, the research that I do would look so obvious. But I think, we talked about bringing diverse perspectives into the field of robotics. Diversity in all different facets are so important. And so, in addition to being a woman, diverse disciplinary backgrounds and approaches and problem framings are so valuable. And so let's see. So in my personal life, I got married not right out of undergrad, but between my master's and my PhD. But when I got married, my husband and I had known each other for 10 years. So we knew each other from when we were 14. And so we went to high school together, we dated through college, and I joke that we do everything on 10-year increments. So we dated for 10 years before getting married. We were married for 10 years before having kids. I now have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old that I had a long tenure track, close to the end of tenure track, but still on tenure track. And the I guess, I think when I, in addition to research, we have this beautiful family, but I joke that sort of the way I approach these things is by, achieving work-life balance. Like the way I achieve work-life balance is by blending the two so much that they are essentially indistinguishable. So I'm also head of house in one of MIT's dorms I was mentioning at the beginning. So I'm like a professor that lives in the house, or kind of a dorm parent, but it's for a grad dorm. So the average age is 26 in the dorm. And that's something that I've carried through, all my years at MIT. As an undergrad, I lived in the dorm, but as a grad student, newly married, my husband and I moved back into the dorm as grad students, as graduate resident tutors. And then when I joined the faculty, I took on a role as an associate head of house, and then later a head of house. And I think I tell my students, these are all critical parts of like doing our best work and my own best work, like creative work, approaching what you do like with happiness and in a well-rested manner, and the community you sort of build. I have an amazing husband. I have an amazing family who don't live close by, like immediately close by, but we've created this sort of expanded family of other heads of house and the students in the dorm. And so basically in that role, I'm like the mayor of a small town, a 700-person small town. And so I try to live my life in a balanced way, but the way I do it is not with big blocks. It's with tiny little blocks that are all interspersed and blended, such that the difference between them is kind of indistinguishable. And that's really worked for me. I think everybody needs different strategies. But I try to take time away from work and do other things. Mostly these days, less so hobbies than just spending time with my kids. But that's a type of a type of mental break from work of its own type. And so and then personally, everything I feel like on paper it looks like I've accomplished a lot. And like there's some coherent plan to this, but really it's just been inventing each next step as I go along and kind of moving in a direction that feels right, and ensuring that I have a lot of help. I have help in every aspect of my life. And so okay, so I'll pause there. I don't know if so hopefully that gives you some entry points for questions or thoughts or directions you want to go with this. I'm happy to pause here and have a little bit of a discussion, or roll right into talking about research, and then we can come back to the conversation. Please let me know what you think would be best.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's a good idea. Maybe if some people have a few questions, I have to say I find it very, very interesting that you still live partially on campus. I find this really amazing, and to have myself been in dorms where you study, it's so the relationship with what you do in your work and what you study, like how you live your life, is like so intertwined. It's kind of magical. It kind of creates a big family. I really get that. That's really cool. And inventing the steps along the way. I think it's a really good approach to keep an open mind in different steps. I think we've seen that. I had a question from Shen Lee from MIT who asked, what are the biggest setbacks you have faced and overcome in your journey so far?
Hello, Shen. Shen is a grad student in my lab. Thank you for coming, Shen. Wonderful. Let's see. So the biggest setbacks I faced, like the biggest challenges I faced. I think, anybody that does research is like, what I'll often like try to tell my students, like when they submit their first papers, is that, anybody that's involved in research like has to kind of grow some thick skin, because like the exercise of being an academic and a researcher is like, it's essentially a constant exercise in being rejected one way or another, right? Like, like your paper's rejected. It's because like 20% of papers get in. Everybody is submitting their best work. Like, it's like nothing you submit is ever perfect. It's just this, how is it not perfect compared to the way the other things are not perfect? And then there's things that are sort of, more individual, like, as a grad student, like every paper is so important. It represents so much of your like mental investment and your time and sort of everything that you're putting into pushing forward something new that hasn't existed before. And then there's, and I remember that very well as a grad student, very well. And then I think that, writing proposals, like proposals are rejected all the time. And then it's like a strange thing at MIT, they keep these stats on like the hit rate for proposals, like such and such % of professors that submit proposals get their proposal accepted. And I like look at those percentages. I'm like, who are those people? Like, because you submit to NSF, you submit to all these other places. And the thing, and then there's bigger things that don't work out, as on tenure track, you kind of early on sort of place these different bets and try a few different things. And then you have to like 2 or 3 years in really, and that's probably the latest, like you have to decide like where you're going to really invest and like what is going to be the thing that makes it out and can change like the academic world or these other settings. And it's a gamble, right? Like you don't really know, like if you knew it would work, then that would be easy. But like none of us do research because we know it's going to work. Everything we do is an exercise in just like exploring the unknown of whether something can even be done or not. So I think maybe one of the things that I always try to remind myself is that like none of it is personal. When a paper is rejected or a proposal, none of this is personal. And the review process, I love the peer review process. I was very slow to archive, and still, even when we put things up on archive, I'm like, all right, I guess we should put it out. Let's put it up on archive, because if you're submitting to great places, the reviews you get back really improve the work, and they provide you insight into the directions for next steps. I'm just a big believer in the peer review process, both for proposals and papers. And then in other places, the feedback mechanism is just much less formal, and it becomes harder and harder to receive feedback. Like, is a research direction you're going in like going to be fruitful or interesting? Like, are you doing something that other people find exciting? Like, how do you solicit that, like the constructive feedback? Like, what is the way that, how I'm going about this can be improved? You have to become very proactive about finding the right sources and actively soliciting that feedback as you go on in your career. It becomes harder. There's less structured mechanisms for it. But I try to actively do that because there's always ways that I can improve. And then try not to, if something doesn't work out, like that's the name of the game. Like all we can do is like take our experiences, gather input, try our best. And then if it doesn't work out, well, we have to backtrack and go down a different direction.
You're not really doing research if you're not failing at some point.
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly. That's right.
If you're always right, there's something you're doing too easily, or you're not really researching stuff.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much for this insight, and I find it really very interesting. Oh, I have another question from Xavier Garand, I think. I'm sorry about my camera. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if you see me clearly, but I'm
I can see you. It's
kind
a
of
little,
in the
it's a little
dark.
but it's
Yeah,
yeah.
I don't know. The settings are completely off. Xavier Garant asks, what is the distinctive trait that you observe in students that turn out to be successful in their academic work?
Yeah. Okay, so I don't recruit students or select students based on GPA or test scores. Actually, sometimes I worry that a perfect GPA might be an indication that like the transition to research might be harder, right? Because there's so if you have a perfect GPA, like then you're like, did you challenge yourself? So then you look at the courses, you're like, did this person challenge themselves? Like they could have done more, right? Like it was too easy for them. And then research is this exercise in setting out, on a path and not knowing you can do it. And there can be even for students that don't have a perfect GPA, there can be a hard transition from undergrad to grad school. So perfect GPA might actually be a flag for me to look forward, not a filter. But someone who has like a very has a demonstrated capability for pursuing an independent direction is enormously valuable. So that could be like through an extracurricular project or through a research project they undertook. I'm less wrapped up around whether that turned into a paper or not, but some, increasingly undergrads have amazing papers, which is baffling to me. There's no way I would have made it in grad school. I had no first author papers back when I applied. So I look at these applications and I just kind of wonder. And then for me, like a clear passion for a direction. Like it doesn't need to be the most focused, crafted, research statement for what they want to do, but independence and demonstrated creative ability to pursue an independent direction and a strong passion. And then the third one is the ability to work hard. And I joke about this because and someone who works hard will outrun a brilliant person who doesn't apply themselves like any day of the week. And I might just be biased because I was one of those people that was not brilliant but worked super hard. And so, modulo living a well-balanced life, which I am I'm a big proponent of. But those three things I think are, and then the particular passion has to line up with projects that relate to what goes on in my lab. But test scores and perfect GPA I think are not the main thing.
I think that's a very valid point, and I hope that the teachers, professors in this conference are taking notes. In terms of diversity, it's very interesting to have not only like big brains, good GPAs, but also like people like really passionate about what they love, and I think it's a very nice way to see and create a diverse team of people with different backgrounds and people who know how to work hard. Because if you worked hard to get your B+, it probably shows a lot more grit than the person who didn't work at all for their A+. So
research takes grit, that is for sure. So
yeah. Good, thank you. So if there's not any questions, I think we'll go directly to, I don't know if you had a little presentation or some stuff to show us, for your research, your lab, and let's get more on the technical side and let's get geeking around.
Wonderful. Okay, so let me try to share my screen. What does this show? Let's see. Can you see this PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah, well, I don't see it full screen. I see the, oh, perfect.
There, okay.
There it is.
Wonderful, okay. Yep, so I guess I've already given you a little bit of background and introduction to myself. And so I'm an AI researcher and a roboticist, and my lab works on developing AI and intelligent machines that are capable of effectively modeling people to facilitate more effective human-machine and human-robot collaboration. And the bigger vision behind our work is to develop computing that augments rather than replaces human capability. And this goes to the problem framing. So there are many efforts that are worthy efforts to advancing the capability of robotics to do what humans can do. And here we think about, well, what is the problem framing for thinking about enhancing human capability? And so my lab and I, we've worked for many years in robotics for manufacturing and industrial settings. And we have many examples of, in the wild, great examples of human-machine collaboration. So in Amazon's warehouses, the shelves are robots and they bring the material, the product to pickers at the edges of the warehouse. But I do like to point out, like, by and large, the systems are working in spaces that are physically separate from people. And then on the right, you see one of these collaborative robots on BMW's automotive line. And these collaborative robots are, a very exciting development in terms of deployments worldwide. They're growing very rapidly. But we do still see often that these systems are working independently of people. So they might be right next to a person, co-located in that sense without a cage, but the tasks they're doing are interdependent. They're not, or they're independent, not interdependent. And so these systems are sort of systems that kind of coexist with us rather than truly collaborate. And sometimes I have a stat, it's like, there's like 1.8 million industrial robots in operation around the world today. I don't have the statistic for Canada, but in the US, there's actually 30 million robots in people's homes today. So that's it dwarfs the number of industrial robots in operation around the world. And those are things that just look like robots, like Roombas. So it doesn't count like the Alexas, the Nows, smart homes. It doesn't account for security guard robots, sidewalk delivery robots. We have, I don't know if you have these, but in hundreds of grocery stores across the country, I've encountered one myself. We have these strange googly-eyed robots that now go up and down the grocery aisles looking for spills. And again, when I say 30 million, sometimes I'll pause, I'll be like, how many robots do you think are in US homes? And from roboticists, the numbers range from 10,000 to, 5 million, or, some would be 100 million, and they'll be the oddball response. The answers range a lot, but usually most people don't think, 30 million is the number. And it's because these systems are really doing very narrowly defined tasks in fairly structured environments, essentially under constant oversight, so that the value they can provide for us is really limited. And the other aspect to this, part of what makes them so limited, is much like the industrial robots, they don't really see us as people. We are nothing but obstacles to these systems. And that's okay if it's one Roomba in your home occasionally when you turn it on that bumps into your ankle. But it doesn't become okay at scale. So as we think about how we can make broader use of these systems in society more broadly, outside of factories and other controlled settings, it becomes not just a small friction, but really, an inhibitants to successful deployment of these systems at scale. And so this is a headline from a few years ago now from San Francisco. And two-ish or so years ago, there were so many startups testing sidewalk delivery robots on the sidewalks of San Francisco. They were littering the sidewalks, and people complained. So the elderly and people with disabilities felt unsafe on their sidewalks. And if you, I was at a AAAS meeting actually, and overheard someone around that time frame. Someone a little on the elderly side complaining to a friend, I just can't even go outside my home anymore. They're everywhere. They make me nervous. I feel like they're gonna bump into me. And so it wasn't just people on the sidewalk. These were engineering and engineers, scientists that felt this way. And if you think about what it's like, if any of you have navigated or sort of interacted with robots, something like this, where it's not giving cues that it sees you, it's not picking up on sort of this very subtle aspects of interaction in a confined environment, this actually can be a dangerous system. So they were typically operated with safety operators, but nonetheless, San Francisco responded to the complaints, and they halted deployment of these systems in the most populated areas of the city, and they relegated them to an industrial sector with no people. And then they further limited the number of them that could be on any block at any time. And so this is problematic for many reasons, right? Like these systems can provide, and you think about where were our robots in a pandemic when many aspects of daily life became much less safe, or are much less safe. These systems, they can't sort of meet what we want them to meet if they're being matured in areas that are separated entirely from people. So there's sort of a development issue here, but it's also the canary in the coal mine. Like these issues that become more than just mere inconveniences, but that affect the deployment at scale, are things that we really need to be able to work on in order to sort of realize the promise of these systems going forward. And so in our lab, we're sort of focused on teamwork. We study aspects of human teamwork, cognitive psychology, cognitive science, and are aiming to build robots that can integrate more effectively, work more interdependently with people. So on an automotive line, for which many in our lab have spent a fair amount of time, the dream would be 3 people are doing this assembly task, which is actually done very flexibly. It's almost like a ballet. Something runs a little behind, someone else picks up the slack, they resequence their work, someone moves quicker, someone hands someone else the next tool. It's really kind of magical. Human beings are amazing. What would it take to take one of these people out and seamlessly integrate a robot that's able to collaborate that flexibly? And so just to summarize, like decades of research in human teamwork, to be a good, and this is studies of pilots and co-pilots in cockpits, military teams, nurses and surgeons in the operating room. To be an effective human teammate, you need 3 things. You need to be able to know what your partner is thinking. You need to be able to anticipate what they'll do next. And then you need to be able to make fast changes as things unfold, as things potentially don't go according to plan. And so our lab works on developing AI that can work with people in this manner, that can integrate more seamlessly into like the planning process, where a human team is working together to formulate their plan of what they want the robot to do, a science rover or a robot for emergency response, or formulating a plan for a human team to go out and deploy, with which a robot is a key component of that plan. Think about standing around a table, working out your kind of like game plan. But of course, we don't elaborate all aspects of how we're going to work together and all our contingencies in advance. So no matter how extensive our planning process, we need to be able to refine plans online. So we need to be able to refine plans based on observation, watching what other people are doing, and through interaction. And once we've refined a plan, we want to then execute it. We want to go and we want to play the game. And that requires a different set of technologies around a robot being able to monitor progress, the human's progress through a plan, and be able to dynamically select and schedule the supporting actions that they'll take. And so I'll just highlight a little bit of work in Refine recently from our lab, and then bring it together and show some progress in the Execute category. And so the work I'm going to show you was motivated from a project maybe about 5 years ago now, in which we worked with a local Boston hospital to develop decision support for this nurse called the charge nurse or the resource nurse. So this nurse that runs a labor and delivery floor, essentially what we discovered was they're essentially doing an air traffic control problem. So they've taken all of this one person takes in all of the information across all these LCD screens and then the handwritten whiteboard of the current state of the labor floor. And she makes task assignment and scheduling decisions. So she decides which patients go to which new rooms, which nurses are assigned to which patients. She controls aspects of the OR schedule and many other decisions. And when you work it out, it's actually computationally more complex than the task of an actual air traffic controller. And she does it without any decision support. There's no codified training process for this job. It's trained sort of through apprenticeship, like over years or even decades. And they talk about doing this job almost like the way an air traffic controller does it. Air traffic controller will say they were born to be an air traffic controller. Air traffic controllers are exceptional people, exceptional. They really were born to be air traffic controllers. And the resource nurses basically say the same thing. So some people can do the job, other people, no matter how much training they have, just can't do it. So there's no rule book. So how do we develop decision support for this nurse? So we developed, inspired by cognitive science, developed an apprenticeship learning approach, a structured model to be able to learn from observations of resource assignment and scheduling decisions. And so I won't go deep into that work or exactly how it worked, but instead I'll just show you a picture of the robot, providing some decision support to the nurse, and then talk about how this inspired sort of the next phase of research in the lab. Okay, so we developed with the hospital this high fidelity simulation environment, had many nurses and doctors kind of play a day in their life in the hospital, and that was our training data. And then we conducted rigorous experimentation of both robot and body decision support and computer-based decision support within that simulation environment. But in addition to that, I'll show you videos here of the proof of concept deployment on the actual labor floor. So this robot is using its onboard camera to read the handwritten whiteboard on the current state of the labor floor and then making a suggestion to the nurse.
What is a good decision?
Right, like, and it kind of made me like,
I recommend placing a schedule to send the infection patient remark fine. Nurse Meredith can take care of her.
And so that's the full set of information that nurse and our system takes as input.
What is a good decision?
I recommend placing a new patient in triage bed number 5.
What is a bad decision?
A bad decision would be to place a scheduled cesarean section patient in room 14 and have Nurse Kristen take care of her.
Ginger, what's a good decision?
I recommend placing a scheduled infection patient in room 10. Nurse Meredith will take care of her.
I don't know if you plan to go back or what, but for me it was like, this is the one. I always plan to go back.
Ginger, what's a bad decision?
We are not.
A bad decision would be to place a scheduled cesarean section patient in room and have Nurse Amy take care of her.
I agree.
Okay, so in our controlled studies, the nurses and doctors accepted our system's recommendation 90% of the time, which is good. We don't have ground truth, so this is really the best we can do to figure out if it's learned a high quality model. So like in our world, this is a great success and this is the end of it. But what does it take to achieve this result? It takes embedding a PhD machine learning researcher, in this case it was Matthew Gambale, who's now an assistant professor at Georgia Tech, on the labor floor, shadowing those nurses for like the better part of a year to identify all of the features or factors that they were using in their decision-making process. So once you identify the features, then we could apply our machine learning model to learn the policy or the rules or heuristics that they were using. But eliciting these features is very, very hard to do from interview and even from shadowing. It requires very substantial domain expertise. And we still didn't get it all right. So there were factors that emerged through the research, like the busyness of the labor floor. No nurse told us that, but their decision-making changed based on how busy the labor floor was. And so this is important for like being able to learn these sort of latent factors that affect decision-making is critically important to a robot that needs to, or a machine that needs to effectively model human decision-making to collaborate with us. And those latent factors need to correspond to the human mental model of the factors that we actually use for there to be a medium of communication around what the system learned and how the person perceives what the system learned. So this inspired the next phase of work in the lab, which is the PhD work of Vaibhav Unholkar, who is now an assistant professor at Rice University, and to be able to take the observable, sort of known decision factors, take observations of decisions, and then via non-parametric approaches learn those latent decision factors, as well as their transition probability and how they relate to the policy that a person is executing. So to jointly learn, in this case, X, TX, and Pi. And so the challenge is that we can't just do it from observable data alone. And so the quick example I can give for this is, try thinking about inferring the latent state of a subway. In New York, it goes uptown, downtown, right? It's like a two-state system. It goes to the end of the line, it turns around, it comes back. But in Boston, we say the subway goes inbound and outbound. So inbound to some arbitrary central point on the line called Park Street. As long as the subway is going towards Park Street from either direction, it's going inbound. And when it passes through Park Street, it's going outbound. So it's a two-state model, but the mental model we hold of it is actually very important to communication around, you know, how that subway works. And so we can't glean that practically from the observable data alone. So the challenge here is to think about how we can take relatively little data from a human in terms of partial labels and other information that can be provided, that can be drawn from the human's high-level expertise, and then how that can be used to inform the inference process. And so, for example, in here specifically, the domain expertise relates to partial policies, like partial rules of the road for how things work, or partial dynamics, like, for example, change points. Turns out if I just tell you the change point for the system is at the end of the line or it's at Park Street, that's enough to sort of lock in the latent state that corresponds to the latent state that I hold as a human. And so, so Vaibhav developed this approach called constrained variational inference to take those partial dynamics and partial policies and reformulate them as constraints on a variational inference process, shape that prior, so that the learned latent states correspond to our kind of human-held ground truth. And this technique, it's very parsimonious with the data that it uses. Fully supervised data can be very, very hard to come by in these settings. But the technique performs equally well to a fully supervised approach. And you can see here an unsupervised approach really can't match the ground truth or the human-held mental model. And so, so these are ways in which we can begin to enable robots through observation and through sort of high-level input that's easy for a person to provide for it to develop this high-fidelity model of us and of the model we hold of the world. And so how does this end up being helpful for collaboration? So what I've done is given you a little insight into what some of the recent techniques from our lab in developing a human model. And then we also have works, which I won't go into, for learning from demonstration and through interaction, the task model. And we can take the task model and the model of the human and give that to the robot in the form of a POMDP, where the robot is maintaining a belief over the human's latent state, which might be intent or preferences, tracking their progress through the task, and then selecting actions such that the two can complete the task in collaboration. And so what I'll do is finish out by showing you a system that brings these pieces together. We evaluated this in a few settings. One was with a handover task, which is kind of more traditional, but the robot needs to predict when and where the human will be to successfully complete the handover. And the other, in that handover task, using this approach of learning the model via this high-level input and solving this POMDP online, of which Shen Li here was a key developer of this technique. That technique achieves improved reward and more successful handovers than either a fully supervised approach with fully supervised training data or a handcrafted approach in which the experimenter tried to design a policy for the robot to perform well with the human. And in this last one, I'll show you the video pulling it together. You'll see a more complex task where the robot and person need to share space effectively and efficiently to do a meal preparation task where the person is preparing sandwiches and the robot is pouring drinks. So they need to deconflict their motion. The person and robot can't be working at exactly the same station at the same time. So the robot's prediction of the person's intent is very important here to deconflict actions. And then as a part of that action space, the robot can select communications as well. It can either explicitly command the human if it's highly uncertain of what the human is doing, or it can provide status updates about what it will do for the person to use in their own planning. So I'll show you a video of this system in action. And so in this case, the robot is selecting its action and communication about every 0.3 seconds. So, so what's to note here is, how often the robot is not communicating. It's actually maintaining a fairly confident belief over what its partner will do.
Hey teammate, let's make some meals. I will pour juice. Please make and wrap the sandwiches. Let's start.
So the robot is deciding where to move next through the task. It can also communicate at any point.
Please make the next sandwich at 2.
So in that case, it was highly uncertain what the person would do. So the robot, explicitly commands the person. That is not a highly efficient communication strategy, but in the presence of high uncertainty. I mean, that's what people do too. They'll explicitly command partners. A more effective strategy when there's less uncertainty or less consequences to provide updates for the other one to incorporate those updates into their planning process. So at this point, you can see the robot isn't communicating because it actually is maintaining a strong belief over where the person will make the sandwich. And so it goes right there to the second station, pours the juice. It's not really juice because liquid is not good for our robots, just in case.
I am pouring juice at 3.
And you can see there the robot updated where it would go next while the person was reaching back and the robot was less clear about where the person would move next.
I am pouring juice at 4. I am pouring juice at 4.
And you can see there the robot actually repeated its communication about 0.3 seconds later, because after that first communication, it was still unsure. This belief was less strong over where the person would go. And so it gives you a sense of how often the robot here is not communicating, which is
I finished pouring
interesting.
juice.
And so to give you a sense in this case, again with joint action planning and communication planning, the human and robot could complete the task more efficiently than if via a handcrafted model for communication or one that does not include communication at all. And interestingly, that benefit is achieved with slightly more communications on average than the handcrafted, and obviously than the no communication model. So it's an indication of sort of the selectivity, but also sort of intelligence of the benefit of when the robot is selecting to communicate here. Okay, so this is some of the recent work from our lab. And what I'll do is just finish out by, again, thank you so much for mentioning the book at the beginning. So this is a book I wrote with Laura Major that I think is very satisfying for me, because I mentioned, my path through was as a human factors engineer before an AI researcher and before a roboticist. And same thing for Laura. So she went on, she's now a CTO of an autonomous vehicle company. She worked in the autonomous systems space at Draper Labs before. But her background through the master's degree was also as a human factors engineer. And both of us for years had been talking about and had been lecturing in various places about how the challenges we're seeing as we think about deploying these robots are unprecedented in some ways, but in other ways do have strong relationship to the challenges that we've addressed in these other sectors. For in thinking about how we design cockpit automation to sort of fit effectively with pilots' capabilities, and then at a societal level, at an infrastructure level, how we don't just, we don't only rely on a totally autonomous air transportation system, right? It's a system that's designed with infrastructure, with policies, that's really co-designed with the technology in quite an intricate way. And that's how we achieve, among the safest air transportation systems in the world. And so there's a lot of insight we can draw that while I've spent much of this talk discussing the work from our lab, which is advancing collaborative autonomy, there's an equally important side to this, which is the design of society, of even our norms, of what we expect when we interact with robots, of the external infrastructure, rather than thinking about sort of the capabilities of these systems only living on board. And so this book includes, an exploration of that, drawing from these other disciplines. And tries to make the case that while many of our challenges are still unprecedented, like, none of us are going to have the training of a pilot in interacting with our Tesla, so that's unprecedented. There's a lot we can learn from issues that have taken lives in other sectors, like mode confusion and aircraft, that we're already seeing crop up in the deployment of these new systems. And so for those that are more interested in hearing more, please do check out the book. Okay, with that I can wrap up and we can do any discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation, and I do agree. Very, very good book that also wraps bigger problems than just designing robots. It just highlights so much aspects of our society, policies. It's a good read. Simple to understand also. It's very well vulgarized. How can I say it? Well, in French it's vulgarisé, but simplified. Well, if you have do you still have a bit time for questions? Because we're.
I do. Yeah, I'd be happy.
Okay. So does anybody have questions?
Maybe just a quick one before I have to leave for another meeting. It was a great talk. Thank you, Julie. It was very, very insightful and interesting. Do you think that the models that you're using can be learned by the robot just by observing for a while and then trying to come up with the policies?
Yeah, so I think there are limitations from learning from observation alone. And I think there are human limitations learning from observation alone as well. You think about, yeah. So I think in some settings it's entirely sufficient. Like if all you want is predictive capability, then there's many different ways you could represent that two-state latent system for the subway, right? And you'll have predictive capability. You know, so but for other applications where it's important that the structure and the dynamics of the latent state correspond to some ground truth or human held model, I think there's fundamental limits of doing that from observation alone.
But if it would be some sort of a collaborative task, in the sense that the robot would present what it observed to validate with the human that is it correct or not? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Like any aspects of active learning, I think, are really what become important here. So like transparency, the systems, that's another capability to develop, right? But the system's ability to elevate the right examples, the right scenarios for feedback to elicit the proper type of feedback from the person based on the person's capabilities or expertise level is a very, very interesting problem that that we're thinking about in the lab for next steps as well.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, François, for the question. Anybody else? Or I might have a quick one. Because when I read your book, I was always thinking to myself, at the end of the day, who has the responsibility to make these robots safe? Should it be like government legislation? Should it be licensed engineers doing this programming or designing? Where are we like right now in terms of where is the conversation going?
Yeah.
I don't know if you, yeah.
Yeah, so it's all of the above. I've had a really interesting opportunity over the past few months to co-chair a task force sort of working group on AI and mobility. So the autonomous vehicle space, looking at like level 4 autonomy, and it involved a conversation with both regulators, sort of executive level technologists from industry, and academics. And one of the aspects that sort of came out of that discussion is how important it is to build an understanding among regulators of the current limitations and what's easy and hard for those systems, and then at a lower level how they work, and then how hard it is to regulate a very fast-moving field when the underlying technology might be changing like on a weekly basis. And safety system engineering in and of itself is a challenge. So safety system engineering is really well suited for a much longer time constant, like elevators, like trains, like systems that stabilize and then have like a lead time of kind of like decades. But safety system engineering for systems where the behavior of the system is changing and driven by data is a very challenging area, equally challenging for the technologists and the regulators. And there's, I think, a broad agreement that the existing techniques we have for system safety engineering are insufficient for the current challenge. And so that's another, I mean, if you want to talk about like, important, next research areas is sort of rethinking what system safety engineering is for these new class of sort of safety critical consumer technologies.
Thank you. Yeah, it really, I really liked the answer, and I think it bounces back to future work that it's, that it still gives ideas to some graduate students listening to us right now, maybe some interesting opportunities. So that was about it. Thank you very much. I would love to discuss a bit more about the book, and I think it was really really awesome. And yeah, I mean, when I heard about like this book coming out, I already got a copy. For the people listening, I made sure that in our 3 university, Université Laval, Université de Sherbrooke, and ETS, I made sure it was in their library. So well, this is very important. This is a very important read, people. So just making it available. Well, thank you very much. And we'll keep in touch for sharing this video and this webinar. So a big thank you. So
thank you so much for having me.
It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.